The pristine cream leather of the passenger seat did not belong under my mud-caked work boots, and the faint scent of expensive espresso clashed violently with the smell of diesel soaked deep into the fibers of my canvas jacket. The hazard lights of my dead 60-year-old farm truck were still flashing a mile back down the dark, rural highway, painting the rain-slicked asphalt in rhythmic, dying bursts of orange. I sat rigid, keeping my shoulders angled sharply away from the door panels so my damp flannel wouldn't stain the upholstery. Rain hammered the roof of the luxury sedan, a relentless drumming that drowned out the quiet hum of the engine. Beside me, the district's newest agricultural auditor shifted the car into park under the flickering fluorescent canopy of the county's only 24-hour gas station. Andrea Smith leaned back against her headrest, tapped her manicured nails against the leather steering wheel, smirked, and spoke. "You know, for a man who explicitly refused my firm's consultation yesterday, you look remarkably grateful for the heater." I kept my gaze fixed on the water washing over the windshield, pulling my hands out of my pockets to rest them flat on my knees. "My alternator gave out? Miss Smith, I appreciate the ride to town. I'll cover the fuel for your trouble. Keep your money, Dario," she instructed, her tone dropping the corporate edge just a fraction. "And it's Andrea outside of business hours." I gave a single, deliberate nod. "Understood. Thank you, Andrea." I reached for the door handle, fully intending to step out into the freezing downpour and handle the tow truck logistics alone. I operated on a strict policy of self-reliance. Owing favors to state auditors was a currency I could not afford to spend. The heavy click of the central locking system landed louder than the rain hitting the glass. I left my hand hovering over the chrome handle and slowly turned my head to look at her. "The tow company is already on their way," Andrea noted, gesturing toward the phone resting in the illuminated cup holder. The screen displayed a confirmed dispatch text. "I called them while you were attempting to negotiate with your engine block." Her tailored trench coat was impeccably dry, the collar turned up against the chill, but I caught the subtle tension around her eyes, a deep, bruised exhaustion that high-end concealer couldn't quite mask. She had been auditing farms for 12 hours straight. I hated the idea of owing her, especially since she was the woman sent by the State Agricultural Board to evaluate the viability of my struggling acreage. "I don't require you to manage my logistics," I stated, keeping my voice level, stripped of any hostility but firm on the boundary. "Consider it a professional courtesy," she countered, adjusting the climate control dial to push more warm air toward my side of the cabin. "Besides, if you catch pneumonia, Inspector Vance will have a field day writing up the Green estate for lack of management." That name landed like a lead weight in the warm cab. Vance. The regional compliance officer had been circling my property for 9 months, weaponizing every minor regulation, waiting for the slightest infraction to justify a forced buyout from the commercial conglomerates eyeing my valley. "Vance will find nothing but healthy vines and compliant soil," I replied, staring straight through the windshield at the neon gas prices reflecting in the puddles. Andrea let out a slow breath, the smirk fading completely into a line of grim professional reality. "He left a formal notice of investigation with my office this afternoon, Dario. He's citing you for improper chemical runoff and threatening a total safety shutdown by the end of the month." I unlatched my seatbelt, the polite restraint I usually maintained cracking just enough to let the cold reality in. A safety shutdown right before the winter pruning phase meant the canopy would overgrow, the dormant vines would rot, and bankruptcy would be swift and permanent. "I use organic titration methods," I ground out, my knuckles white against the dark denim of my jeans. "There is no chemical runoff. I measure the soil pH myself twice a week." "I know," she answered, holding my gaze without backing down. "But Vance's clipboard says otherwise, and until you prove it to the board, you are grounded." I pushed the door open, the freezing rain immediately hitting my face, instantly soaking my collar. "Then I have 30 days to make him eat that clipboard." I stepped out onto the concrete, closing the door softly behind me to protect the glass mechanisms, leaving her in the dry quiet of her car. A tow truck's amber lights pierced the fog down the road, signaling the start of a very long, very exhausting war. The next afternoon, the wind cutting across the valley carried the bitter chill of early winter, stripping the last of the dead leaves from the oaks lining the driveway. I stood on the wraparound porch of the main house, a structure built by my grandfather, tracing the rough grain of the weathered wood railings. The porch was my sanctuary, the only place where the endless, geometric rows of dormant vines made absolute sense. Today, however, the view was interrupted by a silver state-issued SUV parked aggressively close to my tractor barn, its tires crushing the borders of my grandmother's old flower beds. Marco, my foreman, stepped up beside me on the porch, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. He brought the consultant. Marco muttered, his jaw tight. You want me to lock the equipment shed? Leave it, I instructed quietly. If we hide the tools, he writes it up as obstruction. Inspector Vance marched across the gravel, a thick plastic binder tucked securely under his arm. He wore a high-visibility vest that looked utterly ridiculous over his pressed chinos. Behind him, walking with a measured, calm pace, was Andrea. She wore a heavy wool coat today, carrying a sleek digital tablet. Unlike Vance, whose eyes darted around looking for violations, she observed the soil composition, her gaze tracking the natural slope of the land. Mr. Green, Vance barked as he reached the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't bother offering a hand. I assume you received the electronic notice? I did. I did not invite him up the stairs. I also reviewed the precise coordinates you cited for the alleged runoff. They correspond to the old drainage ditch, which was decommissioned 3 years ago and backfilled with limestone. Vance bristled, tapping his heavy pen against his binder in a rapid, agitated rhythm. The water table analysis flags elevated nitrates on the eastern perimeter. You're operating an agricultural hazard, and the state does not gamble with groundwater. I'm issuing a preliminary stop work order. No heavy machinery, no canopy management, no irrigation adjustments until a full topographical survey is completed and approved by a state engineer. A survey takes 6 weeks, I reminded him, my grip tightening on the top rail until the wood groaned. The frost risk begins next week. If I can't run the wind machines or adjust the tension wires, I lose the entire dormant crop. You are effectively ordering me to destroy my own harvest. That is a financial risk you must absorb for the sake of environmental compliance, Vance stated, his mouth forming a thin, bureaucratic line. Miss Smith here is documenting the structural deficits for the regional file. I shifted my focus to Andrea. She was looking at the drainage slope, her stylus hovering over her screen. She hadn't looked at Vance once since stepping out of the car. The code allows for an expedited internal fix if supervised by an independent consultant, she mentioned, her voice carrying clearly over the howling wind. She lifted her chin, meeting my eyes with a look of absolute calculation. If Dario agrees to immediate on-site remediation, the stop work order can be deferred pending a 2-week compliance check. Vance turned an ugly shade of red. I am not deferring anything based on a loophole. Section 4. Paragraph 12 of the Regional Agricultural Mandate. Andrea interrupted, not raising her volume, slicing through his outrage with pure data. It's standard procedure, Inspector. As the assigned third-party auditor, I have the authority to greenlight remediation. Wind hit the porch hard enough to rattle the wooden railing and send a loose metal bucket scraping across the driveway. I looked past her shoulder at the rolling hills of my family's legacy, the dormant vines waiting out the cold, completely dependent on me. Then I looked back down at Vance's heavy binder, the physical manifestation of the system trying to choke me out. My pride pushed hard enough to block my throat, demanding I throw them both off my land and fight it in a courtroom. But a courtroom wouldn't save the vines tonight. I forced the words out. I will remediate the drainage system myself, I declared, staring a hole through Vance. Under Miss Smith's observation, I will not accept a stop work order. Vance sneered, slamming his binder shut with a sharp crack. You have exactly 14 days before the formal reinspection. If one pipe is out of alignment, if one soil sample fails, I'll chain the front gates myself. He turned on his heel and marched back to his vehicle, tires spitting gravel onto the grass as he reversed aggressively and drove away. Marco exhaled a long breath beside me. I'll go pull the trench digger from the back shed, he said quietly, walking away to give us space. Andrea stood alone at the bottom of the porch steps, the wind whipping a stray strand of dark hair across her cheek. I walked down the wooden stairs, stopping 2 steps above her so we were exactly at eye level. I didn't ask for a defense. I wasn't defending you, she corrected, tucking the hair behind her ear with a calm, deliberate motion. I was quoting policy. The fact that it benefits you is entirely incidental to my job. I focused on her hands holding the tablet. She wasn't wearing gloves, and her knuckles were pale, almost translucent from the biting cold. I shoved my hands deep into my canvas jacket pockets instead of offering one to guide her up the stairs. If you are going to be my shadow for the next 2 weeks, you need better gear, I observed. I am perfectly capable of managing my own footwear, Dario, she noted, though a slight, involuntary shiver betrayed her core temperature. I don't doubt it. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the heavy oak front door of the main house. But until you do, the porch has a windbreak, and I have a fresh pot of coffee inside. May I offer you a cup before we start mapping the trench? She looked at the open door, feeling the ambient heat spilling out from the hallway, then back to my face. Black, she requested, stepping up onto the porch. Thursday afternoon brought a sky the color of bruised iron. The eastern slope was punishingly steep, and the old drainage pipes were buried beneath 2 feet of dense clay and jagged rock. I was knee-deep in the newly excavated trench, wrestling a 12-foot section of high-density polyethylene pipe into the earth, fighting the freezing mud that sucked relentlessly at my boots. I had a laser level set up on a tripod 20 yards away, checking the grade every few feet. It had to be a perfect, unwavering 2% drop to satisfy Vance's ridiculous weaponized code. I wiped a streak of muddy water from my forehead with the back of my leather glove, turning back to check the tripod. When I looked up, Andrea was standing at the edge of the trench. She had finally traded her trench coat for a heavy canvas field jacket, and she was holding a steel thermos. Beside her, resting in the mud, was a heavy Pelican equipment case she had dragged from her trunk. "Your baseline is off by 3 millimeters, she informed me, pointing at the digital readout on her tablet. A silver flash drive protruded from the side of the device, blinking with a steady green light. "I'm routing the topography coordinates through my firm's independent encrypted server. Not just the state portal," she added offhandedly, watching the screen. "Vance has a habit of misplacing files that contradict his preferred narratives. I keep my own receipts. I absorbed that piece of information." She was quietly building a wall against Vance's corruption, taking on professional risk to ensure the data remained pure. I climbed out of the trench, my boots heavy with pounds of wet clay. 3 millimeters is within the manufacturer's margin of error, I noted. "Not for Vance," she countered. She held out the thermos. "Drink." I took the thermos, unscrewing the cap with one hand. The coffee was scalding hot and strong, cutting through the chill, settling in my chest. She was standing far too close to the edge of the slick mud. I shifted my weight, stepping purposefully between her and the drop-off, forming a silent physical barrier. I didn't touch her. I simply occupied the space where danger existed. "I'll reseat the pipe," I agreed, handing the steel cup back to her. As I turned, I watched her try to open the heavy Pelican case on the ground. The metal latch was jammed with dried mud. She pressed her thumbs against it, her jaw tight with frustration, refusing to ask for help. I didn't offer platitudes or take over with a sigh. I simply reached into my tool belt, pulled out a small flathead pry bar, knelt beside her, and wedged it under the latch. I applied precise leverage. The lock popped open with a clean snap. Physics. "Andrea," I said quietly, standing back up and returning the tool to my belt. "Leverage always wins. Brute force." "How elegant," she murmured, though a tiny, genuine smile touched the corner of her mouth as she pulled a secondary soil probe from the case. She stood back and watched my hands as I climbed back into the dirt and used a heavy rubber mallet to adjust the pipe. I checked the spirit level, making micro adjustments, striking the plastic with measured, rhythmic force until the bubble rested exactly, perfectly between the black lines. I didn't speak. I let the competence of my craft dictate the pace, proving the care I took with the land through action, not promises. "Your historical ledgers show you've triggered thermal mitigation before," she brought up, logging the new perfect grade into her system. "Do you still have the stamped barometric printouts from the 2024 freeze?" "They are in the barn archives," I confirmed, picking up my heavy toolbox and throwing it onto the grassy bank. "Why?" "Just building a complete profile," she deflected. Though her focus on the screen was intense, her fingers flying across the digital keyboard. I climbed back up the slope, brushing the worst of the mud from my jeans. "The grate is locked. Let's get you back to the porch before you freeze." She nodded, securing her equipment and turning back toward the house. I walked behind her, watching the biting wind catch her collar, keeping my distance but never letting her out of my sight until her boots safely hit the wooden planks. The uneasy, productive truce shattered completely on Tuesday night. The temperature plummeted unseasonably fast after sunset. The weather radio in the barn blared a hard freeze warning just past 9 o'clock. If the ambient temperature dropped below 28 degrees for more than 4 hours, the sap inside the dormant vines would freeze, expanding rapidly and destroying the internal cellular structure. Decades of growth would be wiped out before sunrise. I sprinted from the barn toward the primary wind machines, massive, Industrial steel fans perched on 30-foot poles designed to pull warm air down from the thermal inversion layer and push it across the valley floor. I slammed the ignition switch on the base of the first tower. The propane engine sputtered, coughed a plume of white smoke, and died. I scrambled up the metal ladder with a heavy flashlight clamped in my teeth and a wrench tucked into my belt. I popped the engine cowling. The fuel line was frozen solid. Condensation had built up in the braided steel and blocked the primary injector. I needed heat immediately. Below me, headlights cut through the pitch-black vineyard. Andrea's car skidded to a halt on the gravel access road. She jumped out, leaving the engine running, a heavy, high-lumen flashlight in her hand. The temperature note on my tablet just flatlined. She yelled up at me, her voice fighting the howling wind. "Are the fans down?" "Fuel line freeze!" I shouted back, pulling a small, high-powered blowtorch from my tool belt. "Stand back!" I ignited the torch, applying precise, sweeping heat to the braided steel fuel line, moving the blue flame continuously so I wouldn't overheat the delicate brass fittings. My hands were entirely numb, my breath pluming thick in the harsh light of my headlamp. Too much heat and the line would rupture, spraying highly flammable propane everywhere. "Dario, the temperature at the valley floor is 29 degrees, Andrea warned, her voice tight with real panic. "I have it," I projected, focusing entirely on the brass fitting, shutting out the wind, the cold, and the ticking clock. I watched the thick layer of white frost melt into water droplets. I gave it exactly 5 more seconds, killed the torch, and slammed my palm against the manual rubber primer bulb. I hit the ignition switch. The massive engine roared to life, vibrating the entire steel pole, the 10-foot blades slowly churning, pushing a massive, life-saving column of air down into the vines. I scrambled down the ladder, my boots hitting the dirt hard. "We have 3 more towers to check," I directed, moving fast toward the ATV parked near the fence line. "I'll drive," she decided instantly, tossing her flashlight into the passenger side of my muddy four-wheeler and swinging her leg over the leather seat. She took absolute command of the logistics so I could focus entirely on the mechanics. I didn't argue. I climbed on the back, gripping the rear metal rack. For the next 3 hours, we raced across the freezing, pitch-black hills. She navigated the tight, rutted rows in the dark with terrifying, brilliant precision, never once slipping into a ditch, while I maintained the machines. At the final tower, the ignition wire had snapped entirely from the cold. I stripped the heavy-gauge wire with my bare hands, twisting the sharp copper strands back onto the terminal while she stood close, holding the flashlight perfectly steady, illuminating the freezing metal so I wouldn't slip. When the final fan roared to life, the digital thermometer on her tablet read 28.1 degrees. We had beaten total destruction by a margin of minutes. We sat on the stationary ATV in the middle of the dark, roaring vineyard. I was breathing hard, my hands covered in black grease and copper dust. Andrea slumped forward against the handlebars, a long, shaky breath escaping her lips, her shoulders dropping an inch. "We did it," she exhaled into the cold air. I pulled my heavy leather work gloves back on, securing the Velcro straps meticulously. She stayed beside the ATV, close enough that I could hear her breathing over the rhythmic thumping of the fan blades high above us. And for once, the biting cold of the valley did not feel entirely empty. "You did," I corrected, keeping my voice steady, grounding the moment in fact. "I would have lost 20 acres if you hadn't driven the access roads. I couldn't have maintained the speed alone." She turned slightly, looking at me over her shoulder. The harsh light of the headlamp caught the sheer exhaustion in her posture, stripping away the flawless corporate consultant armor to reveal the gritty, resilient woman underneath. "I couldn't just sit on the porch and watch you lose everything," she admitted softly. "You're supposed to be objective," I reminded her, holding my position, refusing to let the adrenaline push me across the boundary we had set. "I am objective," she countered, turning fully to face me in the dim light, her chin lifting defiantly. "Objectively, you are the best viticulturist in this county. Objectively, Vance is a bully. And objectively, you need to go inside before your hands freeze, permanently." The consequence of our midnight rescue arrived 2 days later. I was standing at the workbench in the barn, calibrating a delicate soil pH meter, when the heavy wooden doors slid open on their iron tracks. Andrea walked in. She was wearing her tailored trench coat again, holding a sealed manila envelope bearing the state crest. The atmosphere in the barn instantly shifted from the quiet camaraderie of the past week back to the rigid, absolute cold of day one. "What is that?" I asked, putting down the calibration screwdriver. She walked to the workbench, placing the envelope carefully onto the scarred wood between us. It's an automated system notice. Vance pulled the data logs from the wind machines this morning. Because the fans were activated during an active structural review, he is citing it as an unauthorized mechanical operation. He has escalated the preliminary stop work order to a full operational shutdown, effective immediately. The hearing is on Friday, she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, lacking its usual sharp edge. At the regional board office in the city, if the board upholds Vance's citation, the bank will trigger the default clause on your mortgage. The property goes into receivership. The barn went so quiet I could hear the little electric space heater ticking in the corner. I picked up the envelope, felt the heavy, fibrous weight of the state paper, the physical proof of my failure, and set it back on the workbench with far more care than it deserved. I stared at the scarred grain of the wood instead of looking at her face. I picked up an industrial rag and began wiping grease off a wrench that was already clean. This was why I handled everything alone. Because in the end, bureaucracy and paperwork always won over the soil. You couldn't outfarm a malicious pen. And your report? I questioned, keeping my tone perfectly flat, scrubbing the wrench harder. The one you have to submit to your firm. What does it say? She looked down at her hands. It states that you operated machinery during a pending review. I cannot falsify the timestamp logs, Dario. If I do, I lose my license and my partnership track. I understand. I set the wrench down and folded the rag into a perfect square. She flinched, as if I had struck the bench with a hammer. She looked back at me, her posture suddenly rigid with intense frustration. Don't do that, she snapped, her voice echoing off the high barn ceiling. Don't shut me out and act like this is just another inevitable loss you have to absorb. I am trying to tell you the parameters of the trap so we can break it. I stopped folding the rag. Break it how? The logs are the logs. The machine was on. I broke the mandate. The logs prove the fans turned on, she reasoned, stepping closer to the bench, her eyes locking onto mine with fierce intelligence. They do not prove why. Vance is framing it as an act of defiance. You need to frame it as emergency environmental mitigation, which falls strictly under Exemption Clause 9b. You need documented proof that the frost would have caused catastrophic failure, and you need a certified state witness to corroborate the timeline. You can't be my witness, I argued, shaking my head slowly. Vance will accuse you of bias. It will ruin your standing with the regional board. I won't let you sink your career for me. Her finger stayed planted on the heavy state envelope. The silver flash drive in her coat pocket caught the dull yellow light of the barn as she shifted her weight. She had walked in armed with a complete legal strategy while I was still standing there holding a clean wrench with nowhere to swing it. I spent yesterday morning on a secure line with my firm's legal compliance team, she revealed, tapping the envelope. They approved an addendum of inspector bias based on the encrypted topography data I've been backing up all week. I am negotiating my own terms in that room, not his. But I need you to build the soil and temperature models. I need hard, undeniable data. Dario, can you do it? I tossed the folded rag onto the bench, the cold isolation shattering completely. Yes, I confirmed. I can build the model. Good. She tapped the envelope once more. Then I will see you on Friday. I didn't sleep for the next 48 hours. I pulled every weather metric, every soil titration log, every historical yield report spanning back a decade. I cross-referenced the topographical map of my newly built drainage trench with the exact barometric pressure of the freeze night. I mapped the thermal inversion layers minute by minute. I bound it all in a thick, meticulously organized dossier. Vance wanted a paper war. I was bringing an arsenal of truth. Friday morning in the city was gray and relentless. The Regional Agricultural Board operated out of a sterile, glass and steel building that smelled of floor wax and ozone, feeling entirely alien compared to the breathing earth of the vineyard. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, wearing a dark suit that felt restrictive across my shoulders. A heavy leather briefcase rested by my boots. Andrea walked out of the double doors of the hearing room. She was in full corporate armor, a sharp, dark blazer, hair pulled back into a severe knot, her expression entirely unreadable. She walked over to me, stopping just outside my personal space. They're ready for you, she announced. She glanced down at my hands, which were resting calmly on the brass handle of the briefcase. I know the truth of my land, I answered, meeting her eyes. I stood up. For a brief moment, she reached out and lightly adjusted the lapel of my jacket. It was a fleeting, grounding action, a silent transfer of solidarity, gone before anyone else in the hallway could notice. "Give them hell," she directed. We walked into the boardroom together. Vance was sitting at the long mahogany table, looking incredibly smug, flanked by 3 senior board members. Mr. Green, the head of the board, an older man with tired eyes and a thick stack of files, began. "Inspector Vance has presented compelling evidence of severe operational noncompliance. What do you have to say for yourself before we formally ratify the shutdown?" I didn't sit down. I unlatched my briefcase, pulled out 4 copies of my dossier, and slid them across the polished table to each board member. "What you are looking at," I projected, my voice filling the room with calm, undeniable authority, "is a certified topographical analysis of the Green Estate drainage system, completed and time-stamped 48 hours prior to the freeze event. Page 3 demonstrates complete compliance with all regional nitrate runoff protocols." Vance scowled, flipping open his copy dismissively. "This doesn't excuse the unauthorized operation of heavy machinery during a stop-work review. The logs show the fans were active. You violated the order." I turned my focus entirely to Vance, refusing to let him control the narrative for another second. "The operation of the wind machines falls under Emergency Mitigation Exemption 9B. I have provided the barometric telemetry data on page 7, proving that without immediate intervention, the ambient temperature would have caused total cellular death within the dormant crop. You have no independent verification of that claim." Vance objected, slapping his hand hard on the table. "It's self-reported data from a desperate farmer. It's inadmissible." "Actually," a voice rang out from the side of the room. Andrea stepped forward from the gallery wall, placing a silver flash drive and a thick, sealed legal document onto the exact center of the table. "I am the assigned independent auditor for the Green Estate. I was on site during the thermal event. I verified the temperature drop via independent sensors, and I directly supervised the emergency mitigation." Vance stared at her, his face losing all color. "Miss Smith, you are supposed to be an impartial observer. You are risking your firm's contract by aligning with a violator. I will have your license for this." "I am aligning with the facts, Inspector," she corrected, her voice cold, forged steel. "The Green Estate is in total structural compliance. Mr. Green executed a flawless technical repair under extreme conditions. Your stop work order is not only unwarranted, it is maliciously targeted. My firm's addendum of inspector bias, containing independent encrypted telemetry data and photographic evidence of your misfiled reports, has been filed, reviewed, and verified by your State Oversight Committee this morning." The room went completely quiet. The only sound was the hum of the overhead vents. The board members looked at Vance, who was suddenly sweating profusely, then at Andrea, and finally at the mountain of undeniable, highly organized proof resting in front of them. The truth was measurable, bound in paper and ink, backed by the full weight of a premier consulting firm. The head of the board closed the dossier slowly. "Inspector Vance, you will recuse yourself from the Green Estate account immediately pending an internal review. Mr. Green, your stop work order is lifted. Have a safe harvest." I closed the brass latches of my briefcase with a definitive click. I looked at Andrea. She gave me a single, sharp nod. The trap was broken, dismantled piece by piece. 2 hours later, we were back at the vineyard. The gray city sky had given way to a crisp, brilliant blue over the dormant vines. I was standing on the breezy afternoon porch, holding 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee. Andrea was pulling a silver laptop from her canvas bag. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, completely devoid of exhaust fumes and sterile city corridors. I handed her a mug. "You took a massive risk today. Vance could have dragged your firm into a protracted legal fight." She accepted the coffee, letting the steam rise between us. "I negotiated my own deal," she replied, setting the laptop firmly onto the wooden porch table and opening the lid. "My firm values accuracy over Vance's ego, and I value competence." The laptop screen illuminated her face, casting a cool glow against the warm steam rising from the mugs. For the first time since my grandfather died, the heavy silence of the estate shifted. The porch didn't feel like a watchtower built for one pair of boots anymore. "I need to finalize the pruning schedule for the North Block," I brought up, keeping my tone perfectly practical. "It requires a meticulous eye to ensure the tension wires are perfectly balanced before the spring thaw." She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes lifting from the bright screen to meet mine. "I cleared my schedule with the regional director this morning," she stated, her voice steady and certain. I've permanently reassigned my Friday city inspections. I'm staying on the green estate through the end of the pruning phase. My firm is keeping me on site to ensure the state doesn't attempt another procedural trap. She reached back into her canvas bag, pulled out a brand new, heavy-duty pair of insulated leather work gloves, and dropped them onto the table next to her coffee mug. Just in case, she added, her mouth quirking upward. The north block is steep, I warned her, picking up my heavy clipboard from the railing. I'll manage my own footwear, Dario, she promised. A genuine, warm smile finally breaking through, softening the sharp edges of the auditor and revealing the partner underneath. I stood beside her on the porch my grandfather built, looking out at the land that was finally safe, knowing exactly who would be walking those rows with me tomorrow. The end. Closing thoughts. Some fights are won with force, but the ones that matter are won with truth, timing, and the people willing to stand in the cold with you. Real partnership isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up with the right tools when the temperature drops. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.